Welcome to True Talk on WMNF 88.5 with Ahmed and Samar. On today's program, we're going to be speaking about the latest in Syria and Israel's attacks there. Of course, since rebel forces have taken over most of Syria, toppling the 54-year reign of the Assad family and toppling Bashar al-Assad, Israel has taken advantage of the political vacuum there and security vacuum to actually bomb relentlessly different targets within Syria. What is Israel's endgame there, and what's the future of Syria with all these different international governments trying to get a piece of Syria? So Samar and I will be speaking to an expert, Mohammed Bazi, about that, and we'll also maybe take some of your phone calls. Of course, this is the post-Christmas show. This is kind of a slower week, I guess, maybe in news, but we're still here. This is live, and we're talking about important topics. So we're going to get to that and more when we come back. This is True Talk on WMNF. We'll be right back.
نعمرها ما عاش يلي زعلها بالحب بدنا نعمرها ما عاش يلي زعلها سوريا الحلوة مجملها لعيونا كل شي بيهون هي 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 معليش رح نصبر ندفي معليش لبدي نكفي معليش رح نصبر ندفي معليش لبدي نكفي برجوع رح نعمل زنبي من الفرحة تبكي العيون هي 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 معليش يل ظلمتونا معليش يل هجرتونا معليش يل ظلمتونا معليش يل هجرتونا معليش لا تترجونا ما من سامح مهما يكون هي 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 والشام رح ترجع إلنا بالغار رح تستقبلنا والشام رح ترجع إلنا بالغار رح تستقبلنا والمستقبل جاي لعنا بدنا نعيش وبدنا نكون والشام جاي تلاقينا تعطر الدروب بياسمين.
Welcome back to True Talk on WMNF 88.5. This was a song called بالحب بدنا نعمرها. With love, we're going to rebuild it or reestablish it. A resistance song out of Syria. It's actually 2 years old, and but it's still very relevant. A lot of Syrians are asking, how are they going to rebuild their country? What is the future going to look like? Samar is joining me now from live. Assalamu alaikum.
Merry Christmas to all our listeners and Happy New Year's. It's next week. This is very, like you said, Ahmed.
What's next week?
Next week is New Year's.
Yeah, the year has gone by so fast. And I mean, well, since you mentioned Christmas, now you and I don't actually celebrate Christmas, but we wish people who do celebrate Christmas to have a happy Christmas. But that does not mean that our faith, because we're both Muslim, that we don't recognize and believe in Jesus and his birth, right?
Of course. We have a whole chapter in the Quran called Maryam, after his mother. It's one of the very beautiful chapters. If people are curious, they can Google Quran and then Google the chapter Maryam and read about how in the Quran the miraculous birth of Jesus is mentioned, and how she brought him to her people, and they said, how could you have such a child out of wedlock, and then the baby speaks and defends his mom. It's beautiful.
Right. It's actually very intimate details that you cannot even when Christian friends of mine like read the chapter called Maryam in the Quran. One, they're surprised that there's even a chapter in the Quran dedicated to Maryam, because they don't find a similar chapter in the Bible dedicated to Maryam or named after Maryam. And they're surprised about the amount of detail found in the Quran about the story, how she gave birth, that it was a virgin birth, that Muslims believe that Jesus was born of this miraculous virgin birth. We actually, Muslims and the Quran, is the only other religion that confirms that Jesus was somebody from God and was born of this miraculous virgin birth. And there's a lot of things close in the story, but there's also differences of the story of Jesus. So, for example, we believe that Jesus was born of a virgin birth, but we don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And that's also made very clear in the chapters of the Quran, that he is similar to Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad and others before him, that he's a prophet and messenger. But we're supposed to follow him, believe in him, and follow his example, but not worship him. Because for us, as Muslims, the only one to worship is the one true God, the creator of all things. I guess the God of that's in the Old Testament. The same God that, for example, the Jewish community or in the Torah, depicted in the Torah, that God that created everything and nothing shares in his might. So I thought, it's always interesting this time of year to mention that, and then people are just surprised. Oh, I thought you guys Muslims are following something completely different. The moon god, for example.
And happy Hanukkah also. I think Hanukkah started when...
last night, maybe? Or is it?
Yes, so happy Hanukkah to all our listeners.
I'm not sure how... Hanukkah is a Jewish holiday, but it's not one of the most important, holidays. I thought it was something that became more important later, because the Jewish community or Jewish leaders at the time wanted to have something that also was around the same time as Christmas.
And Kwanzaa.
And Kwanzaa also. So you have all these holidays happening, and then New Year's is also coming up. So a lot is happening. But during all this, there's all this turmoil that's going on. And now we're going on now in 14th, 15th month of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And that has now been changed, or is... I guess, being impacted by what's happened in Syria with the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, a dictator that his family, he's a dictator that's a son of a dictator. Their family has controlled Syria for something like over 50 years, and now they're completely gone. And Syrians, just about all the Syrians are celebrating, majority of them. There are some concerns within the Kurdish community in Syria, as well as some of the other minorities like the Alawites, who were, I guess, part of the political ruling class in Syria for the past 50 years, because Bashar al-Assad and his family came from that minority community. And, obviously, all of this is going back to colonialism and how these colonial powers, the French and the British, carved up the Middle East, because the borders of Syria as it is today did not actually exist 75 years or 80 years ago. This was something that came out of, just like the borders of Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq, and many of these places did not exist. They were all part of the Ottoman Empire, and the British and the French carved up these different nations after the Ottomans' fall, and somehow put people in control of those nations that were, one, the minority community, and two, they were in favor or allies of those colonial powers. So somehow they became their subcontractors in those countries. right?
Yes, and this is one of the reasons why there is a stifling, an intentional stifling of the spread of democracy. I remember, Ahmed, when I used to do more lecturing, and whenever I go to a church or a synagogue or any place, people would say, "Why the Arabs can't have democracy?" I'd say, tell them because we eat too much hummus in the morning and fava beans. But
That's your
honestly,
sarcasm, right?
yes, of course. But honestly, people need to understand, like you were just mentioning, to what degree colonial powers in the past and now have contributed to the maintenance of such dictators remaining in power, maybe not in Syria now, but in the rest of the Arab world. But I think we're very lucky that we're going to be having Professor Mohammed Bazi to be talking to us. He's an NYU journalism professor, and then he writes a lot about the Middle East, but especially Syria. And if you're interested, you can go to the Guardian website. On December 14, he published an interesting piece. It's called Syria's Future Must Be Determined by Syrians, Not Outside Powers. So I think, Ahmed, Professor Bazi will be talking along these lines because if you read the article and if you follow what was happening in Syria, so many countries were involved in Syria in the past, let's say, 11 or so years since the Arab Spring. So let me just welcome Professor Bazi. Hello, are you there? If you can unmute.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being on the show, Mohammed. I really enjoy following your tweets in English about what is going on in Syria. But I want to go back to the article of the December 14, because you published it immediately, I think, after what had happened in Syria, the overthrow of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. But immediately, Israel started bombing Syria, and also the US bombed Syria. So let me go to that article. You say that the Syrians are the ones who have to determine what happens to Syria. Are you still alarmed that this is not happening or might not be happening, that outside powers will be in control of what's going to go on in Syria?
Well, I am still alarmed by what outside powers are doing. One of the things I pointed out was basically within 24 hours or less than 24 hours after Bashar al-Assad fled Damascus, you had three countries, Israel, the US, and Turkey, all bombing Syria at the same time within the same time frame. To varying degrees, Israel carried out the most intense bombing, and then in the hours that followed, and in the days that followed, Israel was much more intense in its bombing. It destroyed whatever was left of the Syrian military capability. It carried out hundreds of airstrikes over several days, very blatantly, and no one, certainly in the West, very few countries, very few voices opposed that. It certainly would not be acceptable if any other country had did this in this kind of period of chaos. Destroying another country's military and claiming it as a kind of preemptive measure, as a way to not allow the rebels that had taken control of Damascus, not allow them to have access to the Syrian military capabilities, which, certainly by comparison to Israel's, they're very small. So even that small capability, Israel and Netanyahu's government decided was too much of a threat to them to be in the hands of the Syrian rebels. So we have a lot of foreign interference. We've certainly seen it in the last couple of weeks, and as you pointed out in your introduction just a little while ago, we've seen it for the past 13 years or so. A lot of regional powers have been involved in the civil war in Syria, and they're going to have a hard time letting go of it now that the Syrians have a chance to create a government, to create a political system of their own.
Professor Bazi, can you briefly mention which countries have been involved with Syria since the Arab Spring started? Just so our listeners have a refresher, short course on the countries that have been involved with what is going on in Syria.
Sure. So you had, as the uprising started, and it started much like the other uprisings in the Arab world. Generally, it was a popular uprising against the dictatorial regime. In this case, this regime, the Assad regime, was not supported by the U.S. or the West. So you had several countries, especially the Gulf Arab countries, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, support some of the factions that emerged. Some of them were former Syrian army factions, but many had been rebel groups, and some foreign rebels, some foreign jihadists who had come in. So on one side, you had the Gulf countries that were supporting various rebel factions as the uprising changed and morphed into a civil war. You also had the U.S., which was covertly supporting several of the rebel factions. And at one point during the Obama administration, the U.S. was sending about $1 billion a year in support to various factions. And then you had Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah. And with Iran came a lot of Shia militias from Iraq, from Pakistan, from elsewhere, that all were supporting the Assad regime or helping prop up the Assad regime. So in short, you had all, and then of course Turkey was also supporting several of the rebel factions. Turkey was concerned about this. Certainly, they were concerned about the Assad regime itself, but they were very concerned about Kurdish groups. And then you had several Kurdish groups that ultimately ended up being supported by the U.S., largely the SDF forces, the Kurdish militia, and then in later years you had the emergence of ISIS, both in Iraq and then into Syria, and that became the priority for the Western powers to try to contain ISIS and also to prevent Syrian refugees from trying to reach Western Europe and to reach the West. And so a lot of the U.S. and Western powers began to see Syria purely through this anti-terrorism lens, and wanted to wash their hands of it in other ways. So a lot of regional and foreign powers were involved as the civil war morphed and as it went on, and now we have a situation where, for the most part, Iran and Russia have stepped back since Assad has fled, and now we have more of the Western powers. We need to see what they end up doing, and also, Turkey seems to be the biggest immediate beneficiary of the rebels being able to move so quickly and take Damascus and lead to the fall of the Assad regime.
Professor Bazi, before again we get into today's events, I want you to explain, because my co-host Ahmed was just talking before maybe you came on the show about the uniqueness of Syria. And, it's an ancient civilization, but when we're going to be discussing now and alluding to what you have just said, we're going to be mentioning Alawites, Kurds, maybe Christians, minorities. Can you also explain the unique makeup of the Syrian society? And it's I've been to Syria many times and always fascinated by the complexity and the beauty of the many artifacts of the many cultures that existed and exist today. So can you kind of give a picture so people can understand the Syria that we are talking about, the different groups or cultures that exist there?
Sure. So you have a number of ethnic groups and religious groups. The main ethnic variations you have. It's a mostly Arab country, but you also have Kurds who are ethnically different than Arabs, and the Kurds extend into other parts of the region. Certainly, there are Kurds in Turkey, in Iran and Iraq, but there's a significant number of Kurds in Syria, and then you have the Arabs, and they're split religiously among Sunnis, Christians, and a small number of Shia, and then the Alawites, which is a sect that's an offshoot of Shiism, and that happened to be the sect that the Assad family came from. And so in the 54 years of Assad family rule, a lot like the Ba'ath Party rule in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein and sort of relied on extended family networks and relied on many Sunnis for his rule. So in Syria, the Assad family relied on an extensive network of Alawite connected families and military officers and others. And that became even more important during the Civil War after the uprising, where so many Alawites became sort of had even more important security roles in the military establishment and in the security establishment. And now one of the worries today is that there would be score settling, that there would be people who would want to take revenge, people whose family members were killed or imprisoned by the Assad regime might want to take revenge against Alawite military officers and their families. So far, that hasn't happened to a large extent, but we can talk about it as we get to the events of today. There was a troubling episode yesterday, and then extending into today in Tartus, in the coastal area, where there's a large Alawite concentration in Syria. So that's the very rough, basic overview of the makeup of the society right now, and it's a Sunni Arab majority country that was for a long time ruled by a family from the Alawite minority.
Hello, if you're just joining us, this is True Talk on WMNF 88.5. We're speaking with Mohammed Bazi. He's a professor at New York University. And we're speaking about the future of Syria and what's happening there. The Alawites have ruled there for many years, and, by all accounts, or at least an Alawite family, but Bashar al-Assad and his family were backed predominantly in the military by Alawites in the military that were carrying out many atrocities that were documented by human rights organizations. And there was a lot of ethnic cleansing. And of course, he was then supported by Iran militias, as well as the Iran government and Russia. In your opinion, do you think that the reconciliation can happen without any type of accountability for those that assisted Assad in his, tyranny and campaign, which caused the death of hundreds of thousands and displaced millions?
Well, there certainly needs to be accountability. There needs to be accountability for the crimes of the regime before the war and the crimes of the regime after the war, which were significantly worse. As you're saying, there were hundreds of thousands of people killed, many of them by the regime, people who were imprisoned and tortured. So there needs to be accountability for all of these crimes, and there needs to be, rather than a kind of individual score settling, which is always the danger in a post-Civil War scenario like this one. There needs to be a system, and possibly a system that involves some international involvement. So far we're seeing some isolated cases of score settling, and the danger is that those cases would spin out of control or expand, or also there seems to be some pockets of support for the Assad regime and the Assad family and some former regime members, who would like to cause havoc in some ways, and also don't want to protect themselves and their allies from being held to account. So would want to stop the kind of emerging rebel-led order in Damascus, to stop them from going after the rebels in the kind of interim government that they've established. They've been trying to go around and arrest former regime officials, former security officials, people who are involved in the prisons, especially, and in the torture. And so, as that unfolds, there will be people who will try to resist that and cause havoc and try to play on the kind of Alawite fears of the Alawite community as a whole, fearing repercussions from a Sunni-led government. And I think that we have to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like reminiscent of what happened in Iraq post the invasion, which, for the most part, Baghdad was toppled without a lot of fighting. The fighting that Saddam Hussein promised didn't necessarily play out, and likewise, with the rebels that advanced on Damascus, there wasn't much of a fight. People, Assad fled, and his military and security forces disappeared back into civil society. They took off their uniforms, and now they're among the people. Some of them may still have their weapons. They could, maybe start an insurgency, but within the chaos, a lot could happen. What are some of the lessons that the interim administration or the rebels can learn from Iraq to make sure something similar doesn't repeat itself? Because obviously there was a lot of divisions and a lot of, like you were saying, score settling. They were going after, in that situation, it was the Shia militias and groups that were coming and trying to settle scores, and there were all these hit squads, and it wasn't necessarily there wasn't much reconciliation happening. Of course, the difference with that was it was a invasion that was led by the United States, a foreign power, whereas this was more of a local rebel insurgency.
Yeah, it's a very interesting comparison with Iraq that you're laying out, and there are lessons for the interim government, for the rebel leaders who have not taken control of Damascus. So far in the short period, we're a little over 2 weeks since the fall of Assad. I think they've done well. They've done better, I would say, than the American-led forces that took Baghdad, because Baghdad, we remember, had a very quick breakdown in law and order. The American forces were just not concerned with it. I think we can remember the pictures and the videos of basically the Americans surrounded the oil ministry and some of the banks, and basically just allowed everything else to fall into chaos. And even Donald Rumsfeld basically said, "Oh, this is just people kind of this is to be expected." It was a very it was the U.S. absconding any responsibility it had in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. It absconded any responsibility it had as the occupying power. So far, we haven't seen that level of breakdown in law and order, that level of sort of the social breakdown of widespread looting or things like that in Syria. So they've learned some lessons from that. And also, I think one of the differences that it's hard to tell how it's going to play out, but there is anger at Assad for fleeing so quickly and for going to Russia. If you remember, Saddam Hussein did flee, but he stayed in Iraq, and he was captured several months later, but he didn't have this dramatic escape in the same way that Assad did. And we're now seeing reporting emerge from some of the people in Assad's circle that were feel personally betrayed that he didn't help get them out, that he kind of saved his own skin that fateful night in Damascus. So that could blunt some of the kind of a desire to have an insurgency and or to fuel an insurgency. But there will be people whose self-interest is to have chaos and not to be held to account. And that could be one of the things. And also foreign support. If we see foreign countries, helping fuel the insurgency, that could, if they're, sending money, sending weapons, sending people to help. And we'll see how that plays out in the next few months. But there's definitely, there are the elements are there on the ground for that to happen. The question is whether the mixture of events and the mixture of foreign support and foreign intervention would lead to that, or not. And then the actions of the rebels themselves and the rebel leaders. And I would say so far, they've been fairly sensitive to that. They've tried to be sensitive to the concerns of minorities. Again, we're seeing reports of kind of isolated attacks on Alawites, of Christians, on others, on kind of some score settling. But it's not widespread, but it's still early.
It doesn't seem like it's systematic or a policy of the leaders or the current administration to actually go and do that. And it raises a question whether are these really a score settling or are there something more nefarious going on to actually create this type of fear and chaos and polarization, sectarianism to fuel it? Because there was it seemed like an invincible hand that was at play in Iraq immediately after the fall of Saddam to instigate sectarianism more and more, with the bombing of Shiite shrines, for example, in Sunni areas, and blaming it on like Sunni or insurgency and vice versa, to create this kind of sectarianism that didn't necessarily exist in Iraq before the fall of Saddam. I mean, it was there, but people coexisted. It didn't rise to the level. And so you'd have to wonder if somebody's, instigating this type of sectarianism or trying to create it within Syria today for other reasons. But I wanted if you could comment on there were talks that this was the takeover of Damascus and the fall of Assad was more negotiated between Turkey, Iran, and Russia, that this was kind of a negotiated deal. And somehow, I think even I heard the foreign minister of Turkey say that they persuaded Iran and Russia not to come to the aid of Bashar. And in return, they guaranteed some, whether, it's the Iranians that were able to get out or that the Russians will keep their military base and they would not get ransacked, and somehow that the rebels would agree to some of these terms in order to take over Damascus without much of a fight. So have you read some of those reports, and what do you make of it?
Yeah, I've seen references to these possibilities, and it's all within the realm of possibility. Certainly, I don't have any kind of inside information on whether any of it played out this way. And I think it's going to take us some time, months or possibly years, to get the kind of full accounting of what happened in those days leading up to the fall of the regime, leading up to Assad's kind of sudden escape from Damascus. And, probably all the players were pretty shocked at how quickly the Syrian military was handing over territory, was withdrawing and refusing to fight for Assad. And, the conditions on the ground, in retrospect, make it pretty clear. I mean, if you're earning the equivalent of $20 a month for this regime that has basically only been concerned with enriching itself the last 10, 13 years and letting the economy collapse, letting the sanctions take hold, sort of just allowing the destruction of any sense of economic order in society. There's not a lot of incentive to fight for that regime, and unless you're at kind of the top of it and you're the beneficiary. But there was only a handful of people to do that. It's been interesting that the Russian bases have been left alone, and the Russians might get a deal to continue to have these bases. I think they want to continue to have these bases, and there's an interesting argument that for the new rulers of Syria, the kind of whatever rebel coalition is able to take power and sustain power. It might be in their interest to have Russian bases there, because at one time down the line, they might actually confront the U.S.
Right.
And it would be helpful to have at least a Russian military presence, not necessarily that the Russians are going to fight the U.S. for them, but to have options other than the U.S.
As a deterrent.
Yes, exactly. And we're already seeing. It's maybe it should be entirely surprising, but it is interesting that the U.S. hasn't lifted the sanctions yet. They're trying to leverage the sanctions. The U.S. hasn't really given up control of the oil fields that they and the Kurdish allies, the Kurdish forces, have control over many of Syria's remaining oil fields. So all of that is still playing out, and we'll see where it leads, but. The West is not necessarily going to be the best friend of this new government.
Right, and especially, they're using this to try to negotiate, maybe favorable terms for the United States or access or other things, because, Syria continues to be a very strategic location. A lot of the people, especially like on social media and what would be considered the anti-imperialist left, which, we have some of those listeners on our show as well. And that would point to that somehow Bashar al-Assad was a friend of the Palestinians, was a defender of Palestine, was somehow part of the axis of resistance, and was anti-Israel. During their reign, during Bashar's reign, or even his father's, or especially in the past, since Bashar has been there, has Israel faced a threat from the Assad regime during that time?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and the short answer is really no, it hasn't. It's been the quietest border, certainly, and we have a lot of Israeli officials, including Netanyahu himself, at various points saying that border, this Syrian-Israeli border, is quiet. It's Assad and his regime talked a big game about the Golan and getting it back and confronting Israel, but realistically, they didn't do anything themselves. I guess one of the important things they did, but they largely did that for Iran and Hezbollah, was to kind of allow this land bridge for Iran to deliver weapons through Syria to Hezbollah. And that was very important for Hezbollah to build up its missiles, a stockpile of missiles inside Lebanon. And that route is no longer available. Iran has said that. Hezbollah has said that. But the Assad regime itself never confronted Israel. And we've seen a lot of statements from Israeli officials that they preferred Assad to stay, a weakened Assad. They preferred this weaker Assad to rebels that they don't know where they stand. I mean, the rebels aren't running to confront Israel either, for sure. I mean, Israel has now invaded Syria in the last 2 weeks and bombed, carried out whatever the count is, something like 500 airstrikes to destroy the Syrian military assets. So we've seen kind of a quiet on that front for something like the last 40 years. And so the idea that Assad was a friend, the Palestinians, in the end, he basically was a friend only to himself and to secure his own sort of his own survival. And he certainly it seems over the past year, since others in the axis of resistance have been fighting Israel, he resisted pressure to open up or to allow Hezbollah or other militias to open up the front in the Golan against Israel. So, even in the last year, as the Houthis, as Hezbollah, as others have been fighting Israel, Assad didn't do that.
If you're just joining us, this is True Talk on WMNF 88.5 FM. My co-host Ahmed, Bedier, and I are talking to Professor Mohammed Bazi. He's an NYU journalism professor and an expert on the Middle East. Professor Bazi, I have so many questions to ask you, and we have 15 minutes. And our listeners, they can, if you have any questions, you can email them to dj@wmnf.org, dj@wmnf.org. At the moment, Al-Julani seems to be running what is going on in Syria, and I'm looking now at Twitter. He just appointed an intelligence officer or head of Syrian intelligence, and he is Anas Khattab. Some people are very, very fearful of if Al-Julani runs for elections. I don't know what's going to happen really in Syria, but let's say, and he becomes prime minister or president, that the Syria we knew for the past maybe hundreds of years is not going to be the same Syria. Some people are very fearful of Al-Julani. They don't, and if you go to Twitter again and social media, you'll find people going from total conspiracy theories that he is not even Arab or Syrian, that he is an Israeli Mossad agent, to anything you could imagine. From your position as an observer of what is going on in the Middle East and Syria in particular, what can you tell us about Al-Julani, and what can you tell us about the direction Syria is going to take on the political level? Is it going to turn into a republic? Are these fears from an Islamist government valid? What do you think, Professor?
So yes, the fears of an Islamist-led government are valid, because Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Julani's group, and other groups it's allied with, have a history as Islamists, have a history as jihadist groups. Some of them had alliances with Al-Qaeda. They kind of emerged from jihadist movements of the last 10, 15 years, fighting in Iraq, fighting against the U.S. occupation of Iraq, but also fighting against the regimes in Iraq and Syria. So, sure, those fears are valid, because we don't know, as you said, we don't know how it's going to turn out, and we don't know if he seems to be saying the right things. He's trying to allay those fears now, but that it could be a moment before consolidating power. He could be doing that. He seems to be astute politically, and he had plans, and some other people around him had plans to run things when they took power. I think they surprised many people in the region by doing that, by having some plans to put in place and to at least keep the country together in the immediate aftermath. He himself, I think from what we know of his history, of his story, he himself has said he was radicalized by the Second Intifada, by kind of seeing the plight of Palestinians, what they've gone through, what Israel has done to the Palestinians, and then also radicalized by the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and he's charted his journey into being an Islamist and into being a jihadist in over that time, and also he spent time in the U.S. prison in Iraq, probably got further radicalized there, and kind of made more connections with jihadists, and that's when he connected with other figures who would become leaders of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and leaders of ISIS. He met and connected with Baghdadi at some point. So all of that journey certainly is cause for concern. And he's in the last number of years as his group, as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, has said it's severed its connection with Al-Qaeda and kind of as it imposed and ruled Idlib in northern Syria. They haven't been fully democratic. Certainly, they've imprisoned their political opponents. They've ruled with an Islamist tinge. Certainly, they've banned selling of alcohol. They've banned some restaurants and cafes from playing music. I mean, there are fears that they will try to impose that on other parts of Syria, and certainly the tradition in the cities and the large cities of Syria and Aleppo and Damascus are not, even the Sunnis of those cities don't want to see banning of music and alcohol and those things that connect with daily life. There's not going to be a lot of tolerance from everyday Syrians, especially the Syrians in the cities, of those kinds of policies. So we'll see how he and the people around him react to that.
Trump is going to be president soon. Do you have any idea how he is going to deal with Syria, maybe also Israel and the war on Gaza?
On Syria, Trump has basically said he wants to wash his hands of it. Let's not get involved. Those were his initial postings on Truth Social and his initial social media postings as Assad fell. But his administration is going to be involved because the U.S. has a presence. It has troops in Syria. It has the support of the Kurdish forces, the support it provides to the SDF and others, control of the oil fields. And so his administration is going to play a role in Syria. One of my fears would be that he just allows Israel to annex even larger territories, even larger parts of the Golan, that it decides it needs as an extra buffer zone, as a second and third buffer zone that it wants to have. And, we already saw that Trump recognized the illegal annexation of the Golan Heights. Certainly Biden came in and did nothing to reverse that. The Biden administration could have reversed that, but Biden decided not to. So there's a very worrisome aspect to that Trump would just let Netanyahu annex even more territory in Syria. When talking about Gaza and Palestine, Trump could allow Netanyahu's government to annex the West Bank, also sort of illegally do that. And sort of we've seen very few consequences in the kind of this supposed rules-based order to everything that Israel has done to the daily acts of genocide in Gaza. We've seen so little repercussions on. I'm not talking about public sentiment, but on the kind of in the international political order, there's been virtually nothing to stop them because the U.S. won't stop sending weapons and won't stop using its veto power at the UN Security Council.
If you're just joining us, we're wrapping up our show here. We're coming to the end. This is True Talk on WMNF with Ahmed and Samar. We're speaking to Mohammed Bazi from New York University. We're talking about Syria, what the future holds. As, with the toppling of Assad, and this has been basically... Syria has been under dictatorship and tyranny for over the 50 years. They haven't had any form of democracy or civil rights. One of the things or human rights, or any type of rights, except whatever the regime allows. One of the frustrations, and I even noticed it in one of the interviews, I think by the BBC with Al-Julani, the de facto leader of HTS and the current, I guess, leader of the interim administration, who may eventually run for president. there was a focus on the sale of alcohol and dancing and that type of stuff. And there's this fixation from the West that for freedoms, it's focused on alcohol, especially when it comes to the Muslim world. And you can tell when Syrians hear those kind of questions, they kind of just look puzzled because they just came out of war-torn, a country that's torn apart by civil war, people that were tortured. There's no infrastructure, there's no economy, people were starving, hundreds of thousands killed, millions displaced, and the West is just concerned about the rights of being able to drink alcohol. Or there was a story about, some bar that is continuing to serve alcohol in Damascus, and that's somehow a good sign. It seems like the West continues to look at that part of the world that freedom means being able to drink and do things that are not usually permissible within Islamic, culture, even though it's allowed, but it's not part of it. That's how they determine whether, the other issue, of course, is women's rights and women issues. But in what should the current administration or government, in their way to form a new country and build a nation, because in reality they're starting all over, what are some of the things that they should focus on first before they get to some of these other individual freedoms? Because that seems to be the focus of what the West is concerned about, individual freedoms instead of necessarily collective, society concerns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. There is an excessive focus in the West on the individual freedoms. I mean, they're important to an extent, but that there is an over-focus, certainly right now, and there's a disconnect between what Syrians themselves care about. And while many will care about the individual freedoms, they also want the political freedoms and the economic freedoms and the policies that would lead to some economic, at least, well-being and prosperity that the former regime didn't provide. So I would say at the top of what we're hearing from Syrians, and especially Syrians who were active in the early parts of the uprising, is wanting a new constitution that guarantees political freedoms, that guarantees all of the rights that the Assad regime took away and didn't recognize, that guarantees the right to political dissent, which al-Julani and his group have had trouble with. We need to be honest that they haven't really allowed political dissent in Idlib. So those are very critical things for Syrians. I think one of the reasons that they're less resonant with the West, aside from that kind of historic focus on the clash with Islam, or the supposed clash with Islam. So aside from that, is that actually a strong Syria is not really in the West's interest. A strong independent Syria is not going to be, the West is not going to be very keen on that. Partly it's not going to be keen on the potential threat to Israel. It's not going to be keen just on a strong secular independent Syria that pursues its own self-interest and its own policies. Mm-hmm. So that, I think that's one of the realities we're dealing with. And certainly the West doesn't have the best intentions in mind for Syrians.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us, Mohammed Bazi from New York University. I hope to have you back on.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. So this kind of wraps up our program. We're going to end with this بالحب بدنا نعمرها. With love, we're going to rebuild it. And by the way, Samar, you didn't see this, but in the studio, I had my daughter joining me today in the studio. And she's been listening in to us. She had her headphones on. And Mariam, you want to say hi?
Hello.
Hello. So,
good to have you, Mariam, in the studio.
Yeah, you're missing it.
Preparing to take my place or something?
No, it's not. She's just filling in. She's sitting in your seat, and she's enjoying. Mariam, would you like to be on the radio in the future, or what?
I don't know.
Okay, I think she's a little bit shy, but first lesson in, if you're going to be on, you can't be shy. You have to speak, with confidence and
like
talk.
Your dad.
And like Samar.
All time.
So we're about done. NPR News is next. Have a great Happy New Year.
I think
I'll see you next year, Samar, by the way.
Inshallah.
Okay, we're out of time. Take care. NPR News is next. WMNF Tampa. Miriam, take care. Thanks for being my co-host today, even though you didn't talk much.